Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So finally we made it to the last video. Almost didn't think we were going to get here, but the last video in this series on Derrida, repetition. And yeah, as seems to happen quite often, I expected this video to be quite short. I didn't think there was a lot to say about repetition. I didn't think it was that important. But once I kind of get into the topic, as has happened before, and I guess will happen again in future videos, there's just the material just seems to pile up. It grows out of nothing, almost. It seems that way anyway. So this is not going to be a short video. It's just going to be normal. I think normal length, so close to an hour, I would expect. But yeah, repetition is I now think far more important than I originally did, far more central to Derrida's thought. I kind of wish I dealt with it earlier, actually, but you'll see that as we go through the video. Just by way of a little bit of preamble or background explanation of where this the material in this video comes from. Most of it, and the kind of bulk of what really explains repetition, comes from the final essay in Writing a Difference called Ellipsis. And in Ellipsis, Derrida is talking about repetition in relation to a book written by a guy called Edmond called The Book of Questions. And in particular, he references a lot the third part of that called The Return to the Book. And so that title kind of, you can see it, how closely it mirrors repetition, the return to the book, repetition. Derrida gets a lot out of that section. So he kind of frames his discussion of repetition within this context of a repetition of a book, so the return of a book or to the book, and it's there that we get kind of the core of Derrida's ideas about repetition. So in the first part, I've called it the repetition in the book, and we go through what Derrida has to say, referencing the book, referencing repetition as it pertains to a book in particular. And then in the second part of the video, I kind of take that core notion of repetition and look to apply it to some other areas that Derrida mentions in that final essay, but also in other places. So we just get a feel for what repetition is outside this narrow confine that Derrida deals with it in Ellipsis. And the second part then is called repetition in general. So those are the two parts for today's video. Let's get into it. Repetition and the book. So the first and kind of the most important thing I think about repetition is a return. And he describes it as, I mentioned in this essay Ellipsis, with reference to Jabez, so he calls it a return to the book. However, repetition does not reissue the book, but describes its origin from the vantage of a writing which does not yet belong to it, or no longer belongs to it, a writing which feigns, by repeating the book, inclusion in the book. This repetition is the first writing, the writing of the origin, the writing that retraces the origin, tracking from the signs of its disappearance, the lost writing of the origin. So repetition is a return to the book. That's kind of the key idea here, returning to something, bringing about again of something. But it's a return not in such a way that the book is reissued, Derrida says. And by that he means it's not a return so that it is the new iteration is identical to what it originally was. Repetition is never an identical return. And I'll just mention it. We'll talk about this various points in the video as well. That's exactly what Deleuze has to say about repetition. And that'll come back later on as well. So repetition is never an identical return. It's never simply reissued so that there is nothing different about the second time. Instead, then, it's different in some way. So even though it repeats, even though the book is being repeated, the book is returning, it's different from the original, the first copy. Okay, so there's a return to the book, and what this is, keeping with the quote, this return lets us understand the writing or the content from a vantage point which only feigns inclusion in the book, Derrida says. So in other words, this new vantage point that the repetition opens up for us gives us a perspective that transcends the writing as it belongs to, in Derrida's words, as it belongs to the book as content. So it's kind of a going beyond. The repetition brings the book back, but in a slightly different way, in a way that lets us go beyond the text itself, the content of the book. So what is it in repetition that can do this? How does this come about? What is this difference? So the difference that repetition brings about comes about through an act, which is repetition, which aims to describe the origin of the writing. And so Derrida calls repetition in that quote the first writing of the book, precisely because it uncovers the origin. First being the origin. So we're going back to the first writing, to the origin of the book. And this is where from the quote, we want to retrace the origin, tracking from the signs of its disappearance, the lost writing of the origin. We want to get to that original starting point that produced the book before it was its content. So that the content is like prior to there being a message, a meaning to the book, to the text, there is an origin. It comes from somewhere. It came from somewhere. And that's what repetition is trying to uncover here. We're trying to get back to this, the first writing. What was there? What brought about the text, the content, getting back to that origin. And that quote actually retraces the origin, tracking from the signs of its disappearance, the lost writing of the origin. That kind of gives us a hint at what the origin is. And it is, in fact, not the origin, but that which takes its place, which is not, moreover, the opposite of an origin. It is not absence instead of presence, but a trace which replaces a presence which has never been present, an origin by means of which nothing has begun. So this first writing, this origin then, is not strictly speaking an origin, in the sense that it's not something present. It's not something. It's not an essence. It's not a substance. There's no positivity to this origin. But nor is it the opposite of an origin, i.e. an absence. It didn't spring into being from nothingness, ex nihilo. So what are we talking about? Of course we're talking about the trace, or difference with an A, a presence which has never been present. And that's where repetition, returning to the book in this way, uncovers the origin of the book, the first writing. The book, like everything, arises out of difference and trace. And so that's what we've kind of come to. And that's what the repetition has opened up for us. It's given us insight into this origin that is not a positive thing, and it's not an absence, but it's the difference, it's the trace that creates, that produces that thing. Okay, nice. So another idea here, and as we work through this section, we'll just be fleshing out more of what repetition is. So another key idea is the idea that repetition provides an exit from closure. Once the book is repeated, its identification with itself gathers an imperceptible difference which permits us to exit from closure. In redoubling the closure of the book, one cuts it in half. One then furtively escapes from it between two passageways through the same book, the same line along the same ring. This exit from the identical into the same remains very slight, weighs nothing itself, thinks and weighs the book as such. The return to the book is then the abandoning of the book. The return at this point does not retake possession of something. It does not reappropriate the origin. The latter is no longer in itself. So here, what have we got? The repetition of the book gives us the book back, but with an imperceptible difference. And that imperceptible difference is the aiming at the origin, the intention we bring to the return of the book, to the repetition. We now intend not to see the book as its content, not to grasp the words with all their meanings. We want to go beyond that to see where the book came from. We want to retrace we want to go back down its genealogy in a way and find its origin. I can't think of another word for it. It's the perfect word. So this return to the book, but with an imperceptible difference, is what allows us to, as Derrida says, exit from closure. In other words, to break free of that fixed and rigid structure, there's that word again, that the book presents, with its completion and its meaning kind of intact in the content. So the book presents itself as something, a positivity full of meaning, closed. It means what it means, and that meaning is final and fixed. But repetition gives us this opportunity to go beneath that, to see the origin, to escape from that closure of meaning that the content imposes on us, that structural rigidity. It lets us go beneath that, uncovering the origin. So metaphorically speaking, Derrida says this redoubling, the repetition, two passageways through the same book in that quote, creates an exit which allows us to escape the closure, the meaning of the content, taking us to the origin of that content. Okay, nice. So just working our way through that quote, the exit from the identical into the same. This is kind of a key point, and it's going to form the heart of my definition of repetition. An exit from the identical into the same. So Derrida with that is distinguishing between identity and sameness. And I think the way to understand this is that identity is stronger. It suggests singularity. There's only one thing. If something is identical, it's not. There's no point of difference. It sounds like there's only one thing being copied, perhaps, if you have different copies. But there is only one thing, multiple instantiations maybe of that one thing, but it suggests that idea of the singular, oneness. Whereas sameness, I think, is weaker than that. It suggests multiplicity, two things that share the same form, that are the same, but there are two things, not just one thing copied indefinitely. There are multiple things that, although they are the same, they are multiple nevertheless. So I think that's kind of the way to think about this difference between identity and sameness, and we'll see some concrete examples of what that means in a minute. But this exit then that Derrida is talking about here allows us to, just again going back to the quote, allows us to think and weigh the book as such, and he italicizes those words, as such. And I think the idea here is the exit allows us to understand the book itself rather than being distracted by the content, by what the book is trying to tell us. It lets us grasp that origin beneath the meaning, the content. And so this is what he means when he says the return is the abandoning of the book. We're abandoning the content, which is what people usually focus on, to turn to the book itself and its origin, how it came about, which is, of course, ultimately going to go back to the trace and difference, but we'll have every book will have a particular story that's a little bit different from other books, a particular origin that's different. But it will all, of course, I should say, bottom out in difference and the trace. Okay, so there's another idea that I want to share with you, and this is the elliptical nature of repetition, obviously connected to the title of the essay, Ellipsis. The return to the book is of an elliptical essence. Something invisible is missing in the grammar of this repetition. As this lack is invisible and undeterminable, as it completely redoubles and consecrates the book, once more passing through each point along its circuit, nothing has budged. And yet all meaning is altered by this lack. Repeated, the same line is no longer exactly the same. The ring no longer has exactly the same center. The origin has played. Something is missing that would make the circle perfect. But within the ellipsis, by means of simple redoubling of the root, the solicitation of closure and the joining of the line, the book has let itself be thought as such. So repetition is elliptical because even though it returns to the book, repeating it perfectly, we're not changing anything in the book. As Derrida says, once more passing through each point along its circuit, nothing has budged, everything's the same. But it returns in such a way that something is missing from the original. Something is lacking. As he says, that same line is no longer exactly the same. The ring no longer has exactly the same center, despite the fact that we haven't altered anything explicitly in the text. We haven't changed any words. We haven't changed any of the punctuation. Everything is the same, yet something is missing from what there was originally. There's a lack. And what's different? Derrida says the origin has played. In other words, the origin or the trace has been uncovered. It's if I could say this, its non-presence is now felt throughout the whole text. Nothing's changed in the text itself, but as a book, the book as such is now completely different, because that origin has played. The origin is now appearing for us. We've uncovered it. It's now open to us. We can see past the meaning of the book, the content. And so what's the end result here? The end result is that the book has let itself be thought as such, kind of repeating that point. The book itself but this is a good extension. The book itself as a work embedded in a cultural, societal, and historical context appears now, rather than the content, rather than what the author was trying to convey. We've gone beneath that to see where the author got their motivations from, say, where the book, the meaning of the book, the content, the message, how that has come about. We are kind of uncovering that. And you'll notice then that this is exactly what deconstruction is. Deconstruction, I think I defined it as a technique to uncover the difference with an A. In other words, the origin that isn't an origin, a non-present, a presence that was never present, has never been present. That's what deconstruction is, and that's what we're doing with the book, and we're doing it through this repetition. It's being enacted through this act of repetition. Okay, cool. And that's kind of the bulk of it, I think. That gives us everything we need to understand repetition. A couple of other things that are worth pointing out as well. Derrida calls repetition the form of the eternal return. So there's obviously Nietzschean reference there. Definitely not what Nietzsche had in mind, of course, but there is a clear parallel. Obviously, Nietzsche intended the eternal recurrence as a test for one's passion for life. If you could imagine, if you knew that everything in your life was going to be repeated exactly as it happened the first time, all of the goods, but all of the bad, all of the good, but all of the bad as well, all of the terrible, all of the suffering, all of the pain. If you knew that was going to return, you're going to have to live through that again and again forever, eternally. Would you still affirm life? If you can answer yes, then you've passed the test. Zarathustra's passed the test. But if you can't, you're lacking, right? You haven't lived up to that ideal. But that's obviously not what Derrida is saying here. And so I think, the way I read this, he says, I think that's why he includes the word form. He says repetition is the form of the eternal return. So form here meaning something like the way that the eternal return actually happens in reality, rather than as a kind of thought experiment or a test. It actually takes place in reality as repetition. And this is another really, if you've read Deleuze's Difference in Repetition, you'll probably note this immediately. This is exactly what Deleuze has to say about the eternal return. He talks about it as being, capital B, being, which returns but doesn't bring back the same. In other words, making it becoming. So when being returns, it is actually becoming. And that's essentially what Derrida is saying. Here, with repetition, it returns, but in a non-identical fashion. It's the same, but it's not identical. And that gives us this opening. It creates, with regards to the book, it creates this opening, this exit from closure to the origin. And we'll see when we talk about some other instances of repetition, how that non-identical sameness generates repetition, generates difference itself. The final thing I want to mention here is that the way that Derrida also calls repetition the closure of the book, but the opening of the text. And this is a nice way to understand this, I think. The idea being that repetition closes the book as a structure, as that fixed, complete, finished content, but opens it as a work, i.e. something produced out of creativity and difference, and therefore open to further creativity and difference, not locked in a transcendental signified that stops all thought. And I've got a little quote just to capture that, and I'll leave you with that for the end of this section. The question of writing could be opened only if the book was closed. The joyous wandering of the grapheme then became wandering without return. The opening into the text was adventure, expenditure without reserve. And so that's repetition as it applies to a book, the text, just the way that Derrida describes it in ellipsis, but it gives us that framework, I think. And so from here, we'll go on to talk about some other instances of repetition, and we'll see how they flow through. And I think the additional examples will give us more insight into repetition itself. So the second part is repetition in general. So first up then we have repetition and the sign. And we'll start with a quote. As soon as a sign emerges, it begins by repeating itself. Without this, it would not be a sign, would not be what it is. That is to say, the non-self identity which regularly refers to the same. That is to say, to another sign, which itself will be born of having been divided. The grapheme, repeating itself in this fashion, thus has neither natural site nor natural centre. So a sign begins by repeating itself. Okay, Derrida even says somewhere else in Writing and Difference that a sign which does not repeat itself, which is not already divided by repetition in its first time, is not a sign. So it's essential to a sign that it repeat itself. That is what it is to be a sign. A sign, to function as a sign, repeats. At its very inception, as a sign, it repeats. It's not that it's a sign first and then it repeats. The very nature of a sign is repetition. It's built into, if you like, what it is to be a sign. But what does this mean? Okay, so if we think about a typical sign, say a word in a language that refers to, it's a sign for or indicating something else. So a word then, the whole raison d'etre of a word is to form a part of a sentence, right? To be a part of language in use. So that word is repeated in different sentences. So although it's the same shape, the same squiggle, if you like, the same series of squiggles that make up that word, and it refers to the same thing, which is to say it always refers to another sign, another concept, but it isn't identical because it functions differently in each sentence in which it's produced, in which it's repeated. So perhaps it appears with a different meaning used in a different context, or perhaps it changes the meaning of a sentence in a certain way that it doesn't do in another sentence. A good example actually is instead of words, thinking of a letter there, S. The letter S, sometimes it's just refers to, well, sometimes that squiggle refers to the letter S and just forms part of a word, makes up part of a word. Sometimes, however, if it's added at the end of a word, it multiplies the instances of that, whatever the word is. It's pluralistic. It adds plurality to the word. So words or letters, although they are the same thing, referring to the same thing, in other words, referring to another sign, a sign referring to another sign, the same kind of thing, these signs are not identical. And that's what I was talking about earlier, this idea that's going to form the key definition of repetition for us. Return that is the same but is non-identical. And we're going to get an even better explanation of that in the next example that we're going to talk about. And the example that Derrida mentions at the end of that quote, the grapheme, the smallest unit of a language, so maybe a letter in this case, and again repeats in exactly the way that we just described. So with that, Derrida says this grapheme has neither natural site nor natural center, meaning that it's not fixed in where it can appear in words. So it doesn't have a fixed site at which it must appear, nor is it fixed in the meaning that it takes on in each word. So it has no essence, if you like, no natural center, to use Derrida's terminology. And this kind of leads us to that idea of repetition bringing us ultimately to the origin. So when we see the repetition in the sign in this way, this makes visible the origin as trace or difference with an A. Because instead of being distracted by the content, the letter itself or the word itself, the sign itself, we see the form. We see how that content is formed. We see where it comes from. And that gives us insight into, it gives us greater insight that goes beyond just the usage. It doesn't just stop at how these signs are being used, but it carries us at that level of the content, but it carries us beneath that to show us its kind of birthplace, and that brings us back to this ultimate foundation, this core, this final origin of difference and the trace. So the second example that I wanted to go through with you is repetition and the psyche. And I think there is a lot of meat in this particular little topic, so we'll spend a bit of time on this, but I think we can get, like I say, I think my understanding of repetition deepened a lot as I was going through this, just this morning, actually, before I had finished up my preparation. So we'll start with a quote. For repetition does not happen to an initial impression. Its possibility is already there in the resistance offered the first time by the psychical neurons. Resistance itself is possible only if the opposition of forces lasts and is repeated at the beginning. It is the very idea of a first time which becomes enigmatic. In the first time of the contact between two forces, repetition has begun. So we've looked at this quote before, actually. I'm not sure if we've looked at all of it, but we have encountered this before in the video I did on Freud. So we're referring to the impermeable neurons which facilitate memory, this was a metaphor, right? It's not, Derrida and Freud are not suggesting that there are actually these things, impermeable neurons. It's a metaphor for understanding how memory takes place. So let's break this down. Derrida says at the beginning there, we can't say that repetition happens, and he italicizes that word. We can't say it happens to an initial impression or a stimulus. Why? So I thought about this for quite a long time to kind of figure it out, but this is what I've come to. We can't say repetition happens to an initial impression because this abstracts the initial impression, the stimulus, out of the broader context in which it takes place. And remember our definition. Repetition, well, actually I haven't given this definition, but what repetition is, it's the non-identical return of the same. That's how I've described it, although I haven't given that exact definition before, I don't think. So it's the non-identical return of the same, and the only way this can happen, the same can return non-identically, is if what repeats does so in reference to or as part of a broader whole, a broader context. So repetition cannot be focused on, it cannot be locked in on a single thing that is happening again and again. Because if it is, it's just mechanical. It's just, nothing changes, right? Nothing, it's like the return to the book. It's like reading the book again, but with no different goal in mind, with no attempt to get to the origin. If you read it again, you stay, you might learn something different, you might see different things, but you stay at that level of the content. If you want to, and that's not repetition as Derrida's talking about it here. It comes about if something must change, something has to be different in that return. And what's different here, and in general, in fact, and this is kind of what I think is the takeaway from this example. What's different is that the return, the repetition, always happens within a broader context, and it's the context that changes, and it's that which alters the meaning of the specific thing that's returning, that's repeating, whether it's a letter or a sign or the book or a stimulus in the brain. So, because if, and I use these words as well for a reason, if repetition happened, as Derrida says, if it happened to an initial impression, then this would just be mechanical. It would just be, to use Deleuze's term, it would be a bare repetition. Actually, he says mechanical as well. Mechanical, bare repetition, instead of what Deleuze called a spiritual or clothed repetition. So what makes the difference, what makes repetition no longer identical, even though it's the same, is that it takes place in a broader context. It's not just, it's not a, and this ties in with my own kind of metaphysics as well. It's not parts-based. That's how I would describe it. It's not parts-based. It's not a focus on the parts. It's a focus on the context, the whole in which it happens. And it's there, it's in the whole that the difference arises, whether it's a different intention, a goal to understand the origin of the text, the book, or whether it's the whole is a word within which a letter appears. In the letter, although it's the same, it's not identical because the meaning of the word that it's in is different. And repetition here, even though we'll get to how the repetition comes about with this in just a minute, but that's the important point that I wanted to get to. The repetition is non-identical because it happens in a broader context. So another thing that's in that quote that required quite a bit of thought is this idea that the possibility of repetition is already there in the first time the neurons offer resistance. And that's an interesting little line. What does it mean? Again, go back to our definition. Repetition is the non-identical return of the same. So the neurons resist the stimulus. They pose a barrier. They pose a force, an opposing force against it, which makes it impermeable, makes the neurons impermeable. And it's this resistance that creates the possibility for the stimulus to repeat. If there was no resistance, there could be no repetition. The stimulus would just roll through. There would be no sense of repetition. But because those neurons provide a block, then that stimulus has to repeat. So basically, the repetition doesn't belong to the impression or to the stimulus that is repeating. Rather, the repetition is there as a possibility in the neurons. So it's there in the context, not in the specific thing that's repeating, whether it be the book, whether it be a letter, whether it be a word, whether it be this particular stimulus. That's not where repetition, as Derrida understands it, lies, because repetition is non-identical return of the same. And the only way that can happen, you can have a return of the same which is nevertheless not identical. The only way that can happen is if we expand our focus, we relax our focus to take in the broader context. So this means then that repetition is already there in the first time. So in fact, and again, from the perspective of repetition, understanding this process through a lens, if you like, of repetition, the very notion of a first time becomes enigmatic. Derrida says, why? If repetition is always already there in the neurons as a possibility for that broader context, a possibility for something to repeat in this broader context that is the brain, the neurons and the stimulus together, then there's no longer a first time. Because in that first contact, repetition has already begun. It was already there as possibility. That initial contact sets it in motion. So we're at this point now where we want to say there was a first time, but if the first time is the setting about of repetition, then there is no first time. The first time is already repeating, because it as soon as it happens, it becomes a part of this broader context in which repetition is taking place. So what is the repetition in this specific case? How can we, let's flesh this out in some detail. The impermeable or the psychical neurons resist the stimulus, which is attempting to forge a neural pathway. And this means that in order for that stimulus to breach, in order for it to get through, the force must be sustained. It must be repeated. And this means the same stimulus returns, but each stimulus is non-identical to the others because there's a cumulative effect in the wider context, in the wider context which includes the neurons. So each one is contributing to this broader context, this build-up, if you like, of force, which will eventually allow it to breach. And it's that way, again, when you step back, when you include the context, that's when repetition becomes possible. And it's exactly the same with what we said about the book. Nothing has budged, yet all meaning is altered. Same thing with this stimulus. Nothing has changed in the stimulus. It's the same stimulus. It's not more intense or less intense. It's the same stimulus, but there's a difference in the sense that there's accumulation going on here, which means that there will be a breach. So the whole thing is non-identical. So again, seeing the repetition in the brain, and just bringing it back to this idea of the origin, seeing the repetition in the brain makes visible the origin as trace or difference, and in exactly the same way as it was for the sign and for the book. Instead of our attention being drawn to the content, to the specifics, to the details, we see the form. We see how those details are playing out, and it gives us an insight into the origin, the birthplace of this whole process, and it's always going to come out in trace or difference. Finally, I want to talk about repetition and difference with an A. This is just a small point, but I think really gives repetition its importance. It emphasizes how important repetition is. The sense of not being identical, of being other, of being discernible, etc. It is necessary that interval, distance, spacing occur among the different elements and occur actively, dynamically, and with a certain perseverance in repetition. So that last bit is really what I'm looking at here. Difference with an A requires that active, dynamic, spacing, distance, and interval among elements, but it also requires this certain perseverance and repetition, i.e. the same thing returning again, but with that difference, that invisible, indeterminable, slight lack that changes the meaning, that creates something new, that is productive. And this means that what we're really saying here is that it's not just that difference requires repetition, it's that difference is repetition. Anything that repeats, by definition, differs and differs. So repetition is another name or another aspect of difference. Another name for it in the same way I think that we said trace was another name for difference. It describes the same thing, but it describes kind of a different aspect of it. It gives us another point of view on this thing called difference that lets us understand a little bit more about it. In this case, the way that it repeats, the non-identical return of the same. Okay, nice. And that must bring us to our summary. So repetition, I define repetition as a return of the same that is non-identical. So the same thing repeats, but it's not identical because, and this was kind of an important point that I didn't touch on till the very end, the wider context or situation is different in some way. So in order to understand repetition, we have to step outside the details, the content, the individuals themselves, and see how those individuals are playing out in this broader context. Derrida also called it the form of the eternal return. So I glossed as the way, if you like, that Nietzsche's eternal recurrence would actually happens in the world, rather than just as a thought experiment / test for your love for life. Then we looked at some specific instances of repetition. The first was the book. So here the idea was that repetition comes about through us returning to the book with the aim this time of uncovering its origin. So getting away from the content to see the form reveals how that content arises. And this was essentially deconstruction. As regards the same and the non-identical in repetition regarding the book, the same is the content, and what's non-identical is the meaning, in the sense that we are aiming at the origin of the book now, rather than being stuck at the level of content. So the content would be the words and the sentences of the book. The meaning that we're looking at now is the book as attempting to understand the book as a historical, social, cultural artifact, giving us insight into where it comes from, and this lets us understand and appreciate more the meaning that it has. It lets us put that meaning in context, literally. And a nice sentence to kind of capture repetition in the book, just the idea of repetition as escaping the closure of the book by opening the text. A nice little way to understand what repetition's doing there. The second example was the sign. And so the same and the non-identical here referred to the same was the symbol, and the non-identity was again the meaning, but this time by understanding the same within context. So the symbol, it's the same squiggle, it's the same word. The symbol is itself the same, but the meaning of that symbol or sign changes depending on the context. And my line for repetition in the sign is just that the sign begins by repeating itself. So it's the nature of the sign to repeat itself. Repetition is built into the sign. So as soon as it happens, the first time it happens, the sign is already repeating. It's what it is to be a sign. You can't have a sign that doesn't repeat. If a sign appears as a sign, it's repeating from the very beginning. And the third example was the psyche. And here our same and non-identical cashes out as stimulus and the cumulative effect. So what's the same is that impetus of the stimulus, and what's not identical, what's different, is the cumulative effect, that build up that each of these stimuli create with that goal of breaching. And my line that I took from this section is: repetition is in the resistance offered by the neurons at first contact. So the stimulus doesn't repeat by itself, out of context. Rather, the possibility for repetition is in the resistance of the neurons. And finally, I just wanted to say, regarding that last point, difference is repetition. Difference is the non-identical return of the same. Whenever you have that, it's just another way to understand what difference is. Differing and deferring, it is repetition. That is what it is to repeat. And that is Derrida done. Okay, nice. Kind of don't know what to say now. It's like that's finished. Okay, we can leave that, mark it off the to-do list. So that's us for Derrida. In terms of where I'm going from here, I was discussing this with someone in the comments a couple of weeks ago. I think I'm going to look at Ray Brassier and Quentin Meillassoux. I already looked at them. This was like a year ago, I think, with a view to making a video series on them, and it just didn't happen. So I've got a lot of the material already kind of prepared, but I will have to go back and read the books again, I think, because it has been a long time. So that's the next project anyway, will be Ray Brassier, Quentin Meillassoux. I don't think it's going to be a long series because I'm not going to go through their works step by step the way that I have here. It's going to be a little bit more critical, actually. I didn't actually like their philosophies that much, so I don't want to go through them and really get into the details. But I just thought it would be interesting to make a short video series on why I didn't like them. And that whole speculative realist branch or style of philosophy, I think, just doesn't quite gel with me. It was the same with Graham Harman. He's another speculative realist, along with Brassier and Meillassoux. Didn't really like him either in his philosophy. So I expect it'll be similar to that, but it's just interesting to discuss, I think. And sometimes when you read people you don't like, sometimes you do want to hone in on what it is that you dislike about what they have to say, just for clarity. So that's what I think I'll be doing with the next series, Brassier and Meillassoux, but it's going to be a shorter series, probably just a few videos, and really looking at why their ideas didn't appeal to me. But yeah, anyway, thanks for watching through this series with me as I've been making it. Hopefully clarified some stuff for you. Definitely clarified a lot for me. I have a much deeper appreciation of Derrida, and I like him, actually, as I said in the very first video, a lot more than I ever thought I would. I didn't like him at all before I read him. So maybe that's the way to finish this series, by pointing that out. The people who don't like Derrida, of whom I was one, generally haven't read him. So the remedy is read him. And on that note, I think I will sign off. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time around.